Every town has its shadow stories that hide behind church walls, echo across taverns, or linger in the silences of old cemeteries. For one quiet settlement in America, the shadow had a name that no one spoke too loudly: the Blackwood family. Their wealth, their manor, and their lineage were undeniable. But so too was the curse. A curse that seemed cruelly deliberate, striking at the very heart of joy. The tale that survived across generations insists on one horrifying truth: every Blackwood daughter died on her wedding night. Not a month after, not years later. On the very night when bells tolled, vows were whispered, and candles still burned, death would arrive without fail. Can you picture it? The laughter of a wedding feast drifting into screams. The sight of a bride, radiant in silk and lace, never waking to see the morning sun. The Blackwoods themselves tried to guard the story, but the town remembered. Always, the town remembered. Some say the curse began in the late 1700s. Others insist it started even earlier, when the first Blackwood patriarch carved his home from the edge of a dark forest. The details are blurred, shrouded in rumor, fragmented records, and oral tales. What remains is not the certainty of fact, but the weight of dread. And that, sometimes, is more powerful. If you love dark forgotten history, consider subscribing for more stories the world tried to erase. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? It's unsettling to think of these stories reaching you in the quiet of midnight or in the stillness of early dawn. The story of the curse begins, as all haunted legacies do, with a house. The Blackwood Manor stood isolated at the edge of the woods, its chimneys stretching like spires into the mist. Townsfolk swore the air grew colder the closer one walked towards its gates. Some said you could hear whispers in the trees, voices not carried by wind but by something older. Children dared each other to approach, but few lingered when shadows began to lengthen. Despite the growing unease outside its gates, the Blackwoods thrived within. They were a family of pride and of silence. They held lavish gatherings, imported fine wines, and displayed portraits of their ancestors, especially the women. Long galleries in the manor were lined with paintings of brides, each captured in their moment of joy, but there was something disturbing about them. Guests swore the eyes followed you down the corridor, and that the smiles were strained, as if painted by an artist who knew the subjects would never live long enough to fade naturally. The legend grew darker with every generation. Each daughter, no matter her temperament or beauty, no matter the man she married, succumbed to the same fate. Wedding night. Death. The causes differed in the retellings. Some brides collapsed suddenly as though poisoned. Others were found strangled in their gowns, while some lay lifeless with no mark at all, as if their very souls had been claimed. Death, it seemed, was the only loyal guest who never left the Blackwood estate. The townsfolk came to dread the sound of wedding bells from the manor. For them, the chime wasn't a celebration but a countdown. Each toll marked the hours left until another young woman would vanish into the curse. Mothers pulled their daughters close, whispering warnings never to accept a Blackwood proposal. Priests spoke of dark bargains, of sins passed down through bloodlines. And always, the forest loomed, watching, as if it knew something the rest of the world did not. Some believed the land itself had been cursed, that when the first Blackwood set foot upon it, he struck a bargain with forces unseen. Others claimed the women themselves carried a mark in their blood, a pact sealed generations earlier, demanding sacrifice. But what bargain? What secret promise could demand the life of every daughter? Was it greed, power, survival? No one could answer, but no one doubted the truth of the curse. Records are scarce. Family diaries disappeared. Parish ledgers were destroyed in mysterious fires. and legal documents were quietly locked away. It's as though someone wanted the history rewritten, scrubbed clean of anything that would explain why the curse began. Yet, scraps remain. Letters hint at fear. Servants' testimonies recall muffled cries, hurried burials, and strict orders of silence, enough to paint a picture, but never the whole canvas. Through the haze, one detail stands clear: the first bride. The daughter who set the pattern, whose death birthed the legend. She was young, beautiful, filled with the kind of naive hope that wedding days inspire. Her gown was ivory, her hair braided with pearls. Guests toasted with fine wine. Musicians played soft hymns, and the family smiled as though their legacy was secure. But before the sun rose, she was found dead in her chamber, her body cold, her wedding dress stained with the chill of death. The cause accounts vary. Some whispered of blood pooling beneath her. Others of her lips turned blue as though from poison. A few swore she was untouched, her face serene, as though she had simply slipped into a sleep she never awoke from. Whatever the truth, the curse had claimed its first victim, or at least the first recorded one. Did the family know it would happen? Did they hide the cause? Or did they, too, stand shocked as guests fled in terror? That question has never been answered. Perhaps it never will. What we know is, the Blackwood name became synonymous with dread. To marry into the family was to walk willingly into the arms of death. And yet, somehow, the tradition continued. Brides kept arriving, vows kept being spoken, and death kept its vigil. And so, the legend begins not with a celebration, but with a funeral. A story where love transforms into mourning, where every vow is a death sentence, and where the Blackwood daughters stepped into history not as wives, but as brides who never lived to see another dawn. The Blackwood estate was more than just a home. It was a fortress of secrets, looming against the horizon like a scar that never healed. Perched on a hill above the town, the manor could be seen from miles away, its sharp gables and tall chimneys cutting into the sky. To outsiders, it might have looked like a place of wealth and prestige, but to those who lived in its shadow, it was a place of dread, a mansion where light seemed to dim rather than shine. The architecture itself felt strange. Local stonemasons swore that some parts of the manor didn't match the rest, that the east wing was older, built from a darker stone that seemed to absorb the sun. Doors led to staircases that twisted oddly, and corridors ended in walls with no explanation. Visitors claimed they became disoriented within minutes, as though the house was intentionally designed to confuse those who did not belong. Even the family portraits seemed to participate in the unease, eyes lingering on guests as though they were intruders trespassing on hallowed ground. The townsfolk avoided the manor as much as they could. Delivery boys left goods at the gates, unwilling to step onto the gravel path. Children were warned never to wander too close, and if they did, their parents would scold them harshly, as though brushing against the estate was enough to catch a sickness. At night, no villager lingered on the road that wound past the Blackwood's land. Lanterns were dimmed, footsteps quickened, and prayers whispered under breath. The manor wasn't merely feared, it was treated as though it were alive, capable of watching, listening, and remembering. Still, stories leaked. Farmhands working on nearby lands reported seeing strange lights in the forest that bordered the estate. Not lanterns or torches, but flickering orbs that darted between the trees, glowing faintly blue or green. Some swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, low voices in an unfamiliar tongue. Dogs refused to approach the boundary, howling at unseen shapes. Hunters who entered the forest at dusk claimed to feel watched, even when no one was there. It wasn't only the woods that gave rise to rumors. The manor itself was said to be filled with rooms that no servant dared to clean. Locked chambers with keys kept only by the patriarch. windows that were nailed shut despite being on upper floors, and a cellar that stretched deeper than any had reason to dig. Servants who worked for the family often quit suddenly, refusing to explain why. Those who stayed grew pale, silent and tight-lipped, as though speaking might unleash something best left sleeping. The Blackwoods, for their part, denied everything. To their guests, they presented themselves as cultured, respectable, even pious. They hosted balls, weddings, and gatherings that dazzled with wealth. Imported wine, rare fabrics, musicians from distant cities, it was all on display. But beneath the laughter and music, there was always unease. Guests whispered among themselves that the family seemed too calm, too rehearsed, as though each smile was part of a performance to conceal something rotting underneath. The surrounding town became divided. Some saw the Blackwoods as cursed victims, forced to endure a tragedy that none of them deserved. Others suspected darker truths, that the family had done something unforgivable, and the deaths of their daughters were not accidents, but the price of a bargain. Had the Blackwoods traded something to maintain their fortune and land? If so, what was the cost? Who collected the payment? Perhaps the most unsettling detail was the consistency. The deaths never wavered, never delayed. Wedding after wedding, generation after generation, the daughters were taken. This precision felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Could it really be chance? Repeated so often it became legend, or was it proof of a design? A ritual, a curse woven into the very foundation of the house. Even priests avoided direct confrontation with the family. Sermons would mention sin and punishment in veiled terms, but no minister ever dared accuse the Blackwoods openly. Those who did speak too loudly seemed to leave town soon after, disappearing without explanation. Some said the family's influence was too strong. Others whispered that the curse punished not just brides, but anyone who tried to interfere. For the townspeople, superstition became survival. Pregnant women refused to walk past the estate, fearing their unborn children would be marked. Weddings outside the Blackwood family were deliberately planned in distant villages, far from the shadow of the manor. The bells of the local church were rung sparingly, because villagers said the sound carried too easily across the fields and into the estate, as though summoning attention from the wrong ears. Yet, despite the fear, the estate never stood empty. The Blackwoods persisted, generation after generation, living proudly in the house everyone else avoided. They seemed almost defiant, as if daring the curse to break them. But the walls of their home carried the memories. Servants whispered of crying that echoed through the halls long after funerals were finished. Some claimed to see brides' figures wandering the corridors at night, veils trailing behind them, faces pale as chalk. Were these merely grief-stricken hallucinations, or the beginnings of the ghost stories that would grow in the centuries to come? The estate itself became a character in the legend. No longer just stone and timber. It was said to breathe, to hunger, to remember each vow spoken beneath its roof. Perhaps the curse was not upon the family at all, but upon the house, binding every bride who stepped across its threshold. If so, then the manor was not just a setting, but the executioner. And so the Blackwood estate stood tall, proud, and terrible, a place where celebration turned into mourning, where love became loss, and where every daughter knew, deep down, that stepping into its halls on her wedding night meant stepping toward death. The first bride. Her name has been lost to history, burned from records, erased from ledgers, buried under silence. Some whispered it was Eleanor, others said Margaret, a few insisted it was Catherine. What mattered wasn't the name, but the fate. She was the eldest daughter of her generation, raised among the cold halls of Blackwood Manor, schooled in manners, faith, and the art of being watched. From birth, Her life was a preparation for one event, her wedding. The family spared no expense. The marriage was meant to strengthen ties with another influential household, cementing their place in the region's gentry. On the morning of her wedding, the town was abuzz with curiosity. Not everyone was invited, most weren't, but they gathered along the roads to catch glimpses of the carriages. The Blackwoods had always kept themselves apart, yet on this day they opened their gates, if only slightly. Guests arrived in silk gowns and polished boots, their laughter echoing against the manor's stone walls. Inside, the house was transformed. Chandeliers blazed with candles, tables bent under the weight of roasted meats and sugared fruits, and musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery. Servants scurried about, carrying trays of wine, polishing silver, ensuring that everything gleamed. And at the center of it all, the bride, young, radiant, trembling with a mixture of fear and joy. She wore a gown of ivory satin, the train sweeping across the floor, her veil pinned with delicate pearls. Accounts differ on what happened during the celebration itself. Some claimed the festivities were grand, the music lively, the wine flowing freely. Others whispered there was something restrained about it all, that beneath the laughter lurked tension, as though everyone knew a secret they dared not speak. One guest supposedly described the evening as a feast thrown for joy, but held under the shadow of mourning. The bride danced, toasted, and smiled as brides do. The groom, a respectable man from a neighboring estate, looked at her with affection. Nothing in the air suggested what was to come. Yet, as the night deepened, some guests noticed strange details. A draft seemed to follow the bride wherever she went. Though no doors were open, candles flickered only when she passed by, and when she paused by the portrait gallery. A hush fell over the crowd, as though the painted brides on the walls were gazing at her with pity. At last, the celebration ended, and the couple withdrew to the bridal chamber. The door closed, the house quieted, and the guests began to leave. By midnight, only family and servants remained, cleaning up, putting out fires, whispering their goodnights. No one expected the scream. It came suddenly, sharp enough to cut through stone. Servants rushed toward the chamber, but when the door was forced open, what they found has been retold in whispers ever since. The bride lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale, her lips tinged blue. Her gown was still immaculate, no blood, no wound, no struggle. The groom sat in shock, trembling, insisting she had simply stopped breathing. Some claimed his hands were stained with wine. Others swore he had been pale with terror before the scream was ever heard. The official account, what little remains, spoke of sudden illness. A fainting spell, perhaps her heart too weak or her nerves overwhelmed. But the townsfolk did not believe it. Healthy women do not collapse within hours of exchanging vows. And so, the first whispers of the curse began. The funeral was swift. Too swift, some argued. The bride was buried within days, sealed in the family plot beneath the shadow of the manor's walls. No one was allowed to see the body after the night of her death. The groom, shaken and silent, left the estate soon after and never returned. His family, once allied with the Blackwoods, cut ties abruptly, refusing to speak of the marriage at all. What really happened in that room, some claimed she had been poisoned, the victim of family politics. Others suggested suffocation, or a lover's quarrel gone horribly wrong. But the most chilling rumor came from a servant who swore she saw a shadow in the chamber, a figure standing over the bride, tall and faceless, which vanished when the door opened. Was it grief, twisting memory, or had something unearthly claimed the young woman before her life could begin? The Blackwoods remained silent. No public statements, no explanations. They held their heads high, hosted another gathering months later, and pretended life had returned to normal. But the town remembered. They always remembered. And when, Years later, another daughter was married and met the same fate. The whispers became certainty. This was no accident. This was a pattern. From then on, each Blackwood wedding was attended not with joy, but with dread. Guests came out of obligation, not celebration. Servants whispered prayers under their breath as they carried trays of food. Musicians played softer, as though afraid to attract attention. And everyone always waited for the scream. The first bride's story became a warning. Her portrait, painted before her marriage, was hung in the gallery alongside the ancestors. Visitors who stood before it swore her eyes carried sorrow, as though she knew her fate before she walked the aisle. Some even said the veil in the painting seemed to shift, curling like smoke when no wind was present. Her death set the stage for everything that followed. Whether curse, crime, or coincidence, it created a legacy the family could never escape. And with each generation, the shadow only grew darker. The Blackwood daughters were no longer brides of men. They were brides of death itself. Patterns emerged slowly in history, sometimes over centuries, sometimes in the span of a single generation. For the Blackwoods, the pattern announced itself with terrible clarity. After the first daughter's death, there might have been hope that it was an isolated tragedy. A cruel misfortune, yes, but not an omen. Yet, when the second daughter's wedding ended in the same way, any illusions of coincidence began to unravel. Her name, too, has been obscured by time. The few records that remain describe a young woman who was considered more cautious than her sister, wary of the superstitions surrounding the manor. Friends recalled that she often seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting someone to be there. Perhaps she already knew the weight of her family's whispers. Perhaps she even begged to avoid marriage. But in a household like the Blackwoods, duty outweighed fear. The wedding went ahead. This time, the family attempted to make it smaller, quieter. Only close relatives and a handful of respected allies were invited. There was less music, less wine, fewer decorations. It was as though they hoped modesty might ward off whatever force had claimed the first bride. And yet, it changed nothing. By dawn, the daughter was dead, her body discovered in the very same chamber. The cause, once again, was unclear, her face pale, her lips frozen in silence. No wound, no struggle. The town reacted with horror. Two deaths could no longer be dismissed as chance. Whispers of a curse became louder, bolder. Mothers pulled their daughters away from Blackwood men. Even priests began to mutter warnings, though always in veiled language, careful not to offend the family's wealth. And within the manor itself, unease spread like rot. Servants resigned in the weeks that followed, claiming they could not sleep for the sound of footsteps in the halls, footsteps too soft to belong to men, too heavy to belong to children. Still, the Blackwoods pressed forward. They were a family of pride, determined not to bend to rumor. And so, when the third daughter reached her wedding day, the manor once again filled with guests. But if the first celebration had been marked by splendor, and the second by restraint, the third was shrouded in tension so heavy it was almost suffocating. Guests drank in silence, music faltered, and every laugh seemed forced. The bride herself was said to be pale, her veil trembling as though she already knew her fate. That night ended as the others had. Another body, another funeral, another silence. By then, no one in the town doubted the curse. It was spoken of openly and with fear. The bell tower of the local church became a symbol of dread whenever its chime signaled a Blackwood wedding. Villagers whispered prayers, for they knew that by sunrise, mourning clothes would be worn again. The pattern grew stronger with each generation. Every daughter, without exception, followed the same path. Sometimes they were young, barely 16, barely brides at all. Other times they were older. Women who had resisted marriage for as long as they could before finally succumbing to family pressure. But no matter the age, no matter the circumstance, the outcome was identical. They did not live to see their wedding mornings. The circumstances varied, and that made the story even stranger. Some brides were said to collapse suddenly during the feast, wine glasses falling from their hands. Others made it to the chamber, only to be found cold by dawn. A few were reported to scream, their cries echoing through the halls, bringing guests running to locked doors that would not open until silence fell. Always, there was confusion, conflicting testimonies, the official explanation vague and unsatisfying. But the outcome, the pattern remained unbroken. It was around this time that darker suspicions began to spread. The idea of a curse was frightening, but it was also intangible. Many began to whisper that the family itself played a role, that these were not accidents or supernatural punishments, but murders. Could the Blackwoods be killing their own daughters? And if so, why? To protect a secret, to fulfill a bargain, to appease some force lurking in the woods that demanded sacrifice. Such questions were never asked aloud in the family's presence, but they thrived in the taverns of the town. One popular theory suggested that the first patriarch had indeed made a pact, a bargain that demanded the life of a bride for each generation. Another claimed the land itself had been stolen, taken from those who practiced old rituals, and the deaths were vengeance carried down through time. The truth remained uncertain, but with each repetition, the curse grew heavier, darker, more undeniable. It reached a point where the weddings themselves became almost theatrical. Guests would arrive knowing the bride would not survive the night. Some even described the events as grotesque performances, where laughter and music were hollow masks for the grief everyone knew was coming. Imagine raising a glass of wine to a young woman you were certain would be dead within hours. Imagine dancing in a hall where every step echoed like a countdown. That was the reality of a Blackwood wedding. The family portraits grew in number. The gallery walls were lined with painted brides, each frozen in time, their smiles caught between joy and sorrow. Visitors swore the gallery grew colder as more paintings were added, the air heavy with the weight of too many stories ending the same way. Some claimed the portraits whispered at night, a chorus of silken voices, warning the living of what was to come. By the fourth, the fifth, the sixth daughter's death, the legend was sealed. The Blackwoods were no longer merely cursed. They were condemned. And though generations passed, the pattern never broke. It became as predictable as the seasons, and yet, no matter how certain the outcome, each new bride still walked the aisle, still spoke the vows, still entered the chamber. Was it pride? Was it denial? Or was it fear that breaking tradition might be worse than death itself? Patterns define stories. And in the Blackwood story, the pattern was bloodless, yet absolute. Every daughter, every wedding, every night claimed. By the time the pattern had taken root, bride after bride claimed on her wedding night. The whispers shifted from mourning to suspicion. The people of the surrounding towns no longer asked if another Blackwood daughter would die. But why? And as generations passed, one explanation began to take hold. Whispered in taverns, churches, and among servants who fled the manor in fear witchcraft. The Blackwoods were not newcomers to the land. Their earliest patriarch had settled near the dense forest in the late 1700s, bringing with him not only wealth but also practices that seemed foreign to the townsfolk. He had been accused of secrecy from the start, of burying strange objects in the fields, of muttering prayers not found in Christian scripture. Some dismissed these tales as prejudice against a wealthy outsider. But when the daughters began to die, those old suspicions reawakened. Could the family's prosperity be the fruit of forbidden rituals neighbors claimed they saw strange fires in the forest at night, long after the Blackwoods had supposedly retired to bed. The flames glowed green or blue, rising higher than campfires, their shapes shifting unnaturally. Travelers swore they heard chanting, low voices murmuring in an unknown tongue, and some who ventured too close reported seeing figures robed in black, standing in circles, their hands raised toward the trees. Were these truly members of the Blackwood family, or were they shadows conjured by frightened minds? One story told of a farmhand who claimed he stumbled upon such a gathering. He described women in veils moving slowly around a stone altar, their faces obscured, their voices weaving together in something like a hymn but harsher, almost metallic. At the center of the circle, he swore he saw a figure lying motionless, draped in white. Terrified, he fled, and by the next day, another Blackwood daughter was dead, her body prepared for burial. The story spread quickly, though some doubted it, insisting the farmhand had been drunk. Yet the connection was too chilling to ignore. Church officials began to take notice. A few priests whispered of the family's women consorting with forces best left unnamed. They pointed to the repeated deaths as proof of a pact, a bloodline tainted by bargains with the devil. But the Blackwoods were powerful, and accusations of witchcraft were dangerous. No formal charges were ever brought, no investigations pursued. Instead, the suspicions simmered, never boiling over, but never dying out. Inside the manor, however, the rumors felt uncomfortably close to truth. Servants reported that certain rooms were locked and forbidden, rooms said to contain shelves of books bound in cracked leather, filled with symbols no one could read. Others spoke of jars containing strange substances, dried herbs, powders, even animal bones. A few swore they saw the daughters themselves reciting words by candlelight, their eyes fixed on mirrors as though waiting for something to appear. Could these young women have known the curse that awaited them, and tried desperately to fight it? One particularly chilling account came from a maid who worked in the East Wing. She claimed that, on the eve of a wedding, she was ordered to prepare the bridal chamber. When she entered, she found symbols etched into the bedposts, circles, crosses, and something like an eye staring upward. Terrified, she cleaned them away, only to be scolded by the matriarch herself the following morning. "You've undone her protection," the woman supposedly said. That night, the bride was found dead before dawn. If true, these details suggest something far stranger than coincidence. Were the Blackwood women victims of witchcraft or participants? Were the rituals meant to break the curse, or to fulfill it if they were trying to protect themselves? Why did every attempt fail, and if they were complicit? What power could be so cruel as to demand the lives of every daughter? The town grew more superstitious with each death. Farmers refused to sell food to the manor after dark. Carriages passing the estate made the sign of the cross. And when the church bells tolled for another Blackwood wedding, villagers locked their doors and lit candles, praying that the evil contained itself within the manor walls. But fear has a way of magnifying shadows. Over time, the Blackwood's reputation became inseparable from witchcraft. Children were told that if they misbehaved, a Blackwood bride's ghost would come for them. Couples avoided marrying in the same month as a Blackwood ceremony, lest their own union be tainted. And whenever strange misfortunes struck the town, crops failing, livestock dying, children falling ill, whispers always turned back to the manor. Still, no matter how dark the rumors grew, the family never left. They held their heads high, insisting their tragedies were accidents, nothing more. But the eyes of the town told another story, a story of bloodlines cursed, of women sacrificed, of whispers that sounded less like rumor and more like testimony. Perhaps the most unsettling question is this: did the Blackwoods believe the rumors themselves? Did they know of a pact? Or did they dismiss the talk of witchcraft as nonsense? The truth may have died with them, but the evidence soaked into the very soil. Carried in hushed legends suggests the possibility that the Blackwood daughters were more than brides. They may have been offerings. And if that is true, the curse was not merely tragedy. It was ritual. As the rumors of witchcraft swirled louder beyond the estate's walls, the Blackwood men clung stubbornly to denial. They were men of reputation, land, and pride, and to admit that their daughters were cursed or worse, sacrificed would mean surrendering their dignity. So they pressed forward, insisting on tradition, insisting on marriage, insisting that life within their halls would continue as it always had. It is almost impossible to imagine the psychology of such denial. How does a father, after burying one daughter in a wedding dress, still arrange the nuptials of the next? How does a brother, knowing that his sister will not live beyond her vows, still walk her down the aisle with a steady face? Was it arrogance, a belief that wealth and power placed them above the whispers of townsfolk? Or was it fear that to break the cycle might invite an even darker punishment? Whatever their reasons, the men of the Blackwood family maintained appearances with chilling resolve. Each wedding was planned with meticulous care, as though nothing were wrong. The manor's chandeliers were polished, the musicians hired, the food imported from afar. Guests would arrive uneasy, their laughter forced, their eyes darting toward the portrait gallery, where generations of brides seemed to watch from painted silence. And the men would greet them warmly, with smiles that rang hollow. Outsiders could not comprehend it. Some believed the Blackwood men were blind to the truth, desperate to convince themselves that the curse was mere superstition. Others whispered darker theories that the men themselves were complicit, willingly offering their daughters to preserve the family's fortune. Why else, they asked, would they continue arranging marriages, knowing the inevitable end? One particularly disturbing rumor suggested that the patriarch of one generation made a declaration in secret: the curse is not death, but the price of our life. Better the daughters perish than the house fall. If true, it reveals a chilling calculation that the Blackwood men valued their legacy more than their blood. And yet, denial was not so easily sustained within the family itself. Some daughters begged not to marry, their tears ignored or silenced. A few were said to flee, only to be brought back under mysterious circumstances. Was it shame duty, or the long reach of a family determined to keep its traditions intact? Servants whispered of daughters locked in their chambers in the days leading up to their weddings, their pleas muffled by thick oak doors. The townsfolk watched all of this from a cautious distance. By now, they no longer attended Blackwood weddings willingly. They attended out of obligation, fearing retribution if they refused. Guests often left before midnight, muttering excuses, unwilling to witness what always followed. And yet, despite the thinning crowds, the Blackwood men carried on, toasting their daughters with wine that tasted bitter on the tongue, as though mocking the celebration. What drove this persistence pride was one answer, but another may have been something more sinister. Some believed the men were bound by a pact just as much as the brides, that the deaths of their daughters were not simply tragedies, but offerings that preserved the family's land, wealth, and status. Could this explain why the Blackwood fortune never seemed to falter, even as death stalked their halls inside the manor? Silence grew heavier with each passing year. The staff changed constantly, few willing to stay for long. Those who remained often described the atmosphere as suffocating, as though grief and denial had hardened into something tangible. It was as if the walls themselves were watching. One former servant reportedly said, "Every hallway, every locked door, felt like it was keeping a secret." And then there were the portraits. Each time a daughter died, a new painting was added to the gallery. By now, the walls were nearly filled. A parade of brides frozen in their final hours of happiness. Visitors swore the room grew colder with each addition, the air heavy with something unspeakable. One guest, after wandering too long among the portraits, fled the manor in terror, claiming that one of the painted brides had whispered her name. Despite everything, the Blackwood men never stopped arranging weddings, even when neighboring families began refusing alliances. The men found ways through distant relatives, through less prominent unions, through bargains whispered behind closed doors. And every time, the story ended the same. A bride, a vow, a night, a body. The men buried their daughters quietly, spoke no words of mourning, and moved forward as though nothing had happened. It is perhaps this silence that disturbed the townsfolk most, not the deaths themselves, but the refusal to acknowledge them. Grief is human, natural. Yet, in the Blackwood household, grief was forbidden, hidden behind closed doors, swallowed by the walls. To outsiders, the silence looked like complicity, like guilt. So, the question lingers, were the Blackwood men protectors of their family name, blind with pride? Or were they jailers, sacrificing their daughters to preserve a secret too dark to face? Every account leaves room for both interpretations. And maybe that is the true horror. For what is more terrifying that a curse bound the family, or that the men of Blackwood accepted it willingly, sending their daughters to the altar like lambs to slaughter? Legends speak of patterns, but even the most unyielding curses sometimes falter, or at least appear to. Within the long line of doomed brides, there was one daughter who did not die on her wedding night. For generations, her story has been whispered as the single crack in the Blackwood legend, the survivor. Her name was Isabel, though some accounts call her Mary. She was said to be strikingly different from her sisters, fiercely independent, strong-willed, and deeply skeptical of the family's traditions. Unlike the other daughters, she had grown up hearing the curse not as hushed whispers but as a shouted warning. Servants confided in her. Townsfolk muttered behind her back. And even children pointed at her in the street, whispering, "She will be next." Isabel, it seems, carried the curse like a cloak long before she ever wore a wedding gown. As she grew older, she resisted marriage for as long as possible. Where other daughters were married off by their late teens, Isabel delayed into her 20s, a defiance nearly unheard of in that era. She is said to have argued with her father, insisting she would never marry, that no husband was worth her life. And perhaps, for a time, she believed she could outwit the curse simply by refusing to take vows. But the Blackwood men would not allow such defiance. Whether from pride, duty, or fear of what breaking tradition might unleash, they arranged her marriage. The groom was a distant cousin, a man chosen more for his obedience than his love. Isabel protested, but the wedding proceeded. The bells tolled, the guests arrived, and she walked the aisle with fire in her eyes. Here. The story diverges into conflicting accounts. Some say Isabel performed a ritual of her own in secret, scrawling symbols on her veil and whispering incantations she had stolen from forbidden books in the manor. Others insist she swallowed a concoction of herbs meant to ward off death. Still, others say she did nothing at all, merely clung to life with a will so fierce that even the curse hesitated. Whatever the truth, the morning after her wedding, Isabel lived. Her family was shocked, the guests astonished. For the first time in memory, a Blackwood bride had survived her wedding night. The town buzzed with rumor. Had the curse been broken? Had Isabel found a way to defy the darkness that had claimed her sisters for a brief moment? Hope stirred. But hope is fragile in stories like these. In the months that followed, Isabel's survival began to seem less like a triumph and more like a reprieve. Neighbors whispered that she grew pale, restless, haunted by visions. Servants claimed she often woke screaming in the night, swearing she felt cold hands clutching her throat. Her husband, once timid and quiet, became increasingly withdrawn, as though he too carried some unspoken terror. One account describes her wandering the manor's halls late at night, barefoot, clutching a candle that flickered violently. She would stop in front of the portraits of the dead brides, staring for hours, whispering to them as though they answered back. When servants tried to intervene, she lashed out, insisting they had no right to interrupt her conversations. And then, just as the town began to wonder if Isabel had truly escaped, tragedy struck again. The details are murky, deliberately obscured, perhaps, but most versions agree that Isabel's death came not long after her wedding, though not on the wedding night itself. Some claim she was found lifeless in the forest, her gown torn, her face frozen in horror. Others insist she drowned in the manor's pond, her veil floating on the water like a lily. Still, others whisper that she vanished altogether, never buried, her body never recovered. Whatever the version, the conclusion is the same: Isabel did not live long. In the end, her survival did not break the curse. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Was her brief reprieve a mistake in the curse's design? A cruel delay meant to intensify her suffering, or had she truly found a way to fight it, only to be dragged back by a force stronger than her will? The Blackwood family buried the story quickly. Isabel's name was seldom spoken, her portrait hidden away rather than displayed with the others. Some say it was destroyed, others that it was locked in a chamber no one could enter. The family seemed determined to erase the anomaly, to restore the perfect pattern of death on the wedding night. But the town remembered. They always remembered. In taverns, Isabel's story took on a new shape. Some called her the brave daughter, the one who tried to fight back. Others painted her as foolish, dabbling in forbidden arts and paying the price. Still others saw her as proof that the curse was not absolute, that perhaps, with the right ritual, the right sacrifice, it could be undone. And so, Isabel became both a warning and a beacon. To some, she proved the curse could never be broken, only delayed. To others, she represented possibility, the faint hope that, one day, another daughter might succeed where she failed. But hope has a cruel way of twisting in stories like these. For the daughters who followed, the curse did not falter again. One by one, they met their fate. The survivor was remembered not as the one who escaped, but as the one who showed just how inescapable the curse truly was. The Blackwood legend, once a tale of tragedy, was now a tale of inevitability. Even survival, it seemed, was just another form of death. Every curse reaches a breaking point, a moment when the weight of repetition becomes unbearable. For the Blackwoods, that moment came with the last daughter of the line, the one whose wedding was not merely whispered about but obsessed over. By the time she reached marrying age, the legend had already hardened into inevitability. Everyone knew what would happen. The only question was how. Her name was Eliza, though in some tellings she is called Anne. Unlike Isabel, the so-called survivor, Eliza seemed resigned from the start. Raised in a house echoing with stories of death, she never pretended to believe she had a future beyond her vows. Servants remembered her as a quiet girl, pale and contemplative, often seen wandering the manor gardens alone. One remarked, she carried herself as though she were already a ghost. Yet, despite the family's long history of tragedy, her father insisted on a grand wedding. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps desperation. Maybe he hoped that by amplifying the spectacle, by filling the manor with music, candles, and witnesses, he could somehow overwhelm the curse. The invitations spread far beyond the town, reaching neighboring villages and distant relatives. For weeks leading up to the event, gossip swirled like wildfire. Some saw it as morbid entertainment, a chance to witness the curse firsthand. Others came out of pity or out of obligation. By the time the day arrived, the Blackwood estate had not seen such a crowd in generations. The manor was dressed in finery garlands of white roses, silver candelabras blazing with light. Musicians rehearsing in the halls, but beneath the grandeur, unease festered. Guests whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes darting to the portrait gallery, where the painted brides stared back with hollow smiles. Some admitted later they could hardly eat, each bite tasting of ash, as though the feast itself had soured with dread. Eliza walked the aisle in silence. Witnesses described her as ethereal, her face calm but unnervingly detached, as though she were not truly present. Her gown shimmered in the candlelight, a veil cascading like mist over her shoulders. When the vows were spoken, her voice was steady but distant. One guest later claimed it sounded less like a promise of love and more like a confession to death itself. The reception that followed was lavish but heavy with expectation. Musicians played, though their melodies faltered. Guests raised glasses, though their hands trembled. Every laugh seemed hollow, every toast strained. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the scream. Some slipped away before midnight, unwilling to witness what they believed was certain. But many stayed, drawn by morbid fascination, as though they were watching a play whose ending was already written. The night stretched on, and for a time, nothing happened. Midnight passed in silence. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Guests began to murmur, could it be? Had Eliza broken the curse? Her father smiled for the first time in years, relief flickering in his eyes. Servants dared to hope, whispering prayers of gratitude. Even the guests began to relax, laughing nervously at their own fears. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the night the legend would end. But the curse does not break so easily. At dawn, when the first light of morning crept through the windows, the chamber door was forced open. Eliza lay on the bed, her veil torn, her face frozen in a grimace of terror. Her hands were clawed at her throat, her eyes wide, glassy, staring at nothing. Unlike her predecessors, there was no serenity in her death, no illusion of peaceful sleep. It was as if she had fought against something unseen and lost. The groom was discovered unconscious beside her, alive but raving incoherently. When he awoke, he spoke of shadows in the room, of voices whispering in languages he could not understand. He swore he saw Eliza's reflection in the mirror stand and walk toward him, even while her body remained on the bed. He never recovered from the terror. Within months, he left the region entirely, and no one heard from him again. The family buried Eliza swiftly, as they had the others. But this time, something shifted. There were no more daughters to marry, no more brides to offer. The line had ended, and with it, the curse seemed to fall silent. The townsfolk, however, would not let the story rest. Eliza's death became the most infamous of all, retold endlessly in chilling detail. Her wedding was remembered not as a celebration but as a public reckoning. The night when dozens of witnesses finally saw the curse play out in its full, merciless form. Her story spread far beyond the village, carried by travelers and gossipers, until the Blackwood name became synonymous with doom. What remains most haunting about Eliza is the contrast between hope and horror. For a few fleeting hours, she had seemed to escape, to survive the night that had claimed so many before her. And then, at the moment of dawn when safety seemed certain, death came anyway, more violent than ever, as though the curse wanted to remind everyone there was no escape. The Blackwood men, their line broken, faded into obscurity soon after. But the memory of Eliza, the final bride, remained. In many ways, her death was the climax of the legend, the moment when even hope was extinguished, leaving only fear in its place. And so, the pattern ended, not with relief, but with confirmation. The curse had claimed every daughter, every bride, and though the family line was gone, the shadow of their story lingered, spreading like a stain across generations of memory. The Blackwood name was finished, but the curse was only beginning its afterlife in the whispers of those who swore they still saw Eliza's veil drifting through the halls of the abandoned manor. After Eliza's death, the Blackwood line withered like a tree struck by lightning. No more daughters were born, no more weddings arranged. The manor, once filled with the laughter of celebrations and the hushed tears of funerals, fell silent. Within a few short years, the surviving men either died, fled, or simply disappeared into obscurity. The estate was left abandoned, a monument not of grandeur but of grief. Time transformed the manor into something else entirely. Where once there had been chandeliers blazing with candles, now there were cobwebs and dust. The windows grew opaque with grime, the gardens choked with weeds, the forest pressing ever closer as though eager to reclaim the land. Doors sagged from their hinges, and the roof groaned in the wind. By the mid-19th century, the Blackwood Manor was no longer a house, but a haunted relic, a place avoided by nearly everyone, yet spoken of constantly in whispers. Stories grew in the absence of the family. Travelers who dared to pass by at night claimed to see candlelight glowing faintly in the upper windows, even though the house had stood empty for decades. Some swore they heard music drifting faintly across the fields, wedding hymns carried on the wind. And always, there were the brides. Pale figures, veiled in white, glimpsed, wandering the corridors through cracked shutters or drifting in the gardens with gowns that brushed silently through overgrown grass. The bravest souls were the trespassers, farm boys on dares, drunkards emboldened by liquid courage, or curious strangers who heard the legend and wanted proof. Many returned shaken, speaking of cold air that clung to their skin like frost, even in summer. Some claimed to hear sobbing echoing down the halls. Others described doors slamming shut of their own accord, or whispers rising from the walls, too faint to understand yet too clear to be mistaken for wind. A few never returned at all. One of the most chilling accounts came from a group of young men who entered the manor on a dare in the 1870s. They carried lanterns and knives, laughing loudly to mask their fear. But within minutes, the laughter ceased. They claimed that, in the portrait gallery, every candle flame flickered out at once, plunging them into darkness. When they relit their lanterns, one portrait had changed the painted bride's eyes, which had once gazed serenely forward, now stared directly at them, her expression twisted with sorrow. They fled, leaving one lantern behind. When townsfolk retrieved it days later, it sat untouched beneath the very portrait, its glass cracked as though struck from within. Ghost stories multiplied, and with them, superstition deepened. Locals swore the manor was cursed ground. Farmers refused to plow too close, fearing their cattle would sicken. Hunters avoided the woods, claiming the trees themselves whispered warnings. Even the road that passed near the estate grew unused. Carriages detoured miles out of the way rather than risk catching sight of the house at dusk. And yet, despite its decay, the manor seemed unwilling to die. Each storm that should have collapsed its roof left it merely scarred. Each fire rumored to sweep through the woods never touched its walls. It stood like a stubborn sentinel, defying time, as though the curse that claimed its daughters now protected its shell. By the late 19th century, the Blackwood estate had become a local legend, a place mothers warned their children never to approach. Preachers used it as a metaphor for sin, calling it a house built on bargains with the devil. But for others, it was irresistible. Writers, folklorists, and even amateur ghost hunters traveled to see it, each adding their own layer to the legend. Some spoke of hearing the faint toll of wedding bells when none had rung in decades. Others described the chilling sight of bridal veils drifting through upper windows, caught on air that had no source. One particularly strange account came from a traveler who spent a night in the manor's decaying parlor. He claimed that, at midnight, he awoke to find himself surrounded by women in wedding gowns. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving silently in unison. Before he could scream, they vanished, leaving only the faint scent of roses. He fled at dawn, never to return. His account, published years later in a small-town newspaper, only fueled the manor's reputation. The more stories spread, the more the town came to believe that the Blackwood brides had not simply died, they had remained. Bound to the estate, they wandered its halls endlessly, repeating their final moments. Some swore they could hear the faint sound of silk rustling down the corridors. Others said the air outside the manor always smelled faintly of extinguished candles, as though a wedding had just ended in tragedy. Children dared each other to touch the gates, swearing they could feel vibrations, like the pulse of a living thing. Old men claimed the curse was not finished, that the land itself demanded blood, and that someday another daughter, some distant Blackwood descendant, would be drawn back to the estate to fulfill the pattern. The manor became more than a ruin. It became a symbol, a warning carved into the landscape itself. Even abandoned, it demanded attention. Even silent, it whispered its story. And for those who dared step too close, it promised one chilling truth: the Blackwood brides had not rested. They were still there, waiting, their veils trailing through the dust of time, their eyes fixed on any who entered. The family line had ended, but the curse lingered etched into the very stones, echoing through the empty halls, and the Blackwood estate, crumbling yet unbroken, stood as proof that some houses are not merely haunted. They are alive, fed by death, sustained by secrets, unwilling to let go. Legends rarely fade when they are drenched in fear. Even as the Blackwood family vanished into history, their story remained stitched into the fabric of the town, growing darker with every retelling. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the name Blackwood was spoken only in whispers, and even then, reluctantly. To say it aloud was to invite misfortune, or so the townsfolk believed. The curse of the brides became more than a local tale, it turned into folklore, spreading beyond the village, carried by travelers, writers, and the curious who were drawn to tragedy. Each retelling added new details: ghostly brides drifting through the manor halls, bells tolling at midnight, shadows watching from windows that should have been empty. For some, it was a story of witchcraft and bargains with the devil. For others, it was a tale of family pride so stubborn it destroyed itself. For most, it was simply a warning that joy can turn to horror in an instant, that love itself can be cursed. The townspeople clung to their superstitions. They refused to marry in the same month as a rumored Blackwood anniversary. Some avoided wearing white altogether, fearing it would invite the attention of the dead brides. Children were told not to linger by the manor, lest one of the veiled figures call them inside, and on stormy nights, when lightning illuminated the abandoned house, villagers swore they could see silhouettes in the windows, brides standing silently, waiting. Researchers who came to study the legend often found little in the way of concrete evidence. Records were missing, family Bibles burned, letters destroyed. The church archives contained only fragments, mentions of funerals without details, notes of weddings without names. It was as though someone had deliberately erased the truth. Yet the lack of evidence only made the story stronger. After all, what is folklore, if not the shadow left behind when history refuses to explain itself? The Blackwood estate became a destination for the curious, though few dared step inside. Stories circulated of academics who entered to seek answers, only to leave within hours, shaken and pale, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One professor from a nearby university allegedly spent a night in the manor and emerged muttering about brides without faces. He never published his findings, and within a year he disappeared completely. Folklorists noted the consistency of the tale across generations, unlike many ghost stories, which morph and fracture over time. The Blackwood legend remained chillingly uniform. Every daughter died on her wedding night. The details of how shifted poison, suffocation, shadows, vanished bodies, but the pattern never changed. That consistency, they argued, was either proof of a collective memory too strong to fade, or evidence of something far more sinister, a truth too dark to deny. For the villagers, the manor was not a ruin, but a presence. Even empty, it seemed alive, feeding on their fear. Few dared to touch its gates, but those who did swore the iron was colder than ice, even in the heat of summer. Hunters claimed no birds ever perched on its roof. Children whispered that if you pressed your ear to the ground near the family cemetery, you could hear faint sobbing beneath the earth. And still, the brides remained the heart of the story. Pale women in white, drifting through dreams and waking visions alike. Travelers who stayed too long in town claimed they saw veils fluttering across moonlit fields. One farmer swore he saw a procession of brides walking silently through the woods at dawn, their gowns trailing dew, their faces hidden. When he called out, they vanished, leaving only the faint smell of extinguished candles. The legacy of fear became self-sustaining. Parents warned children. Children grew into adults who warned their own children. The curse became a lesson, a reminder of unseen dangers, of bargains that outlived those who strike them. Even those who scoffed at superstition found themselves uneasy when passing the estate, glancing over their shoulders as though expecting a veil to brush against their face. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the Blackwood story is its incompleteness. Was it truly witchcraft? A pact sealed in blood and shadows? Was it murder, concealed beneath generations of silence, or was it mass hysteria? A town so consumed by fear that coincidence transformed into legend, none of these answers satisfy. None explain why every daughter, every single one, was lost. And so, the tale endures, not as history but as a haunting. A reminder that some houses never die, some stories never rest, and some names are better left unspoken. To this day, locals still refuse to walk near the manor at night. They say the curse is finished, the bloodline gone. But then, in hushed tones, they add, some things do not end. They only wait. Because perhaps the Blackwood brides are still there, veils trailing through dust and shadow, waiting for another vow, another ring, another night to claim, and perhaps, one day, another descendant unknowing, unprepared will return to that cursed ground, and the pattern will begin again. The story of the Blackwood family lingers not because it is neatly explained, but because it never is. Each death, each whispered detail, is a fragment of something larger, something deliberately hidden. And in that absence of certainty, fear thrives. We are left not with answers, but with echoes, brides who should have begun new lives instead buried in gowns, a house that refuses to crumble, a curse that refuses to be forgotten. The tale's power lies in its unresolved nature. Was it witchcraft, a pact struck in desperation? Was it murder, committed in silence to preserve a secret? Or was it simply the cruel hand of fate, repeated until it became myth we will never know? And perhaps that is the point. Even now, the Blackwood name is a shiver in the dark, a reminder that love and joy can turn to terror in the span of a single night. It is a story that teaches us how quickly celebration can sour, how fragile life is when shadowed by forces we cannot understand. The brides of Blackwood did not live long, but they endure in legend, in whispers, in the uneasy glance of anyone who hears their story. What do you believe really happened? Were the brides victims of a curse, or pawns in something far more human? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you crave more stories that history tried to erase, subscribe for more. Darkness runs deep through forgotten places, and there are always more tales to tell. Continue watching this video here, and step further into the shadows.